On a busy Friday evening in downtown Portland, the Silver Spoon restaurant buzzed with its usual dinner crowd. Richard Chen, the restaurant manager for the past 8 years, prided himself on maintaining the establishment's upscale image. His perfectly pressed suit and meticulously groomed appearance reflected the high standards he expected from both his staff and patrons. As the dinner service reached its peak, Chen noticed a disheveled man in worn-out clothes lingering near the entrance. The man's weathered face and tattered backpack immediately set off alarm bells in Chen's mind. He had dealt with homeless individuals disturbing customers before, and he wasn't about to let this one disrupt his carefully curated dining atmosphere. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Chen announced firmly, approaching the man with his hand already reaching for his phone. "This is a private establishment." The man, who appeared to be in his mid-50s, simply smiled and reached into his pocket. Chen immediately tensed, his finger hovering over the emergency dial button. But instead of anything threatening, the man pulled out a pristine business card. "Actually," the man said softly, "I think you'll want to read this first." Chen's eyes widened as he read the card. James Richardson, CEO of Culinary Ventures International. His hands began to tremble slightly as he recognized the name of the company that had recently purchased the Silver Spoon restaurant chain. The same company that had announced upcoming changes in management. But you can't be." Chen stammered, his face flushing red with embarrassment. "Mr. Richardson is supposed to be a successful businessman in a tailored suit?" James chuckled warmly, his eyes twinkling with amusement rather than anger. "That's exactly why I'm here like this. You see, I've spent the past month visiting all our newly acquired restaurants across the country, but not as James Richardson, CEO. I've been coming in as just another person on the street." Chen felt his world spinning as the implications sank in. The man he had almost called the police on wasn't just any homeless person, he was his new boss. But more than that, he was conducting an undercover operation to see how their restaurants truly operated when they thought no one important was watching. James pulled up a chair at the nearest empty table, his demeanor completely transforming the space around him despite his appearance. "Sit down, Richard. We need to have a serious conversation about customer service, human dignity, and the true meaning of hospitality." The other diners had begun to notice the unusual scene unfolding, their curious glances darting between the immaculately dressed manager and the seemingly homeless man commanding such authority. Chen slowly sank into the chair across from James, his mind racing through all the implications of what had just happened. "You see, Richard," James continued, his voice gentle but firm, "a restaurant isn't just about fine wines and fancy tablecloths. It's about creating a space where every human being is treated with respect and dignity. The true measure of a high-class establishment isn't in how well it treats its wealthy clients, but in how it treats those who appear to have nothing to offer in return." Chen sat there, absorbing every word as the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade into the background. He thought about all the times he'd quickly dismissed people based on their appearance, all the snap judgments he'd made in the name of maintaining the restaurant's image. "But sir," Chen managed to find his voice, "we've had incidents before, security concerns." "Of course," James nodded understandingly. "Safety is important. But there's a difference between maintaining security and maintaining prejudice. Do you know what I observed during my month of visiting our restaurants dressed like this?" Chen shook his head, still trying to process the surreal situation he found himself in. "I've seen incredible acts of kindness from minimum wage workers who offered me water on hot days. I've witnessed teenage hostesses who treated me with more dignity than some executives I know. And I've also seen managers who seem to forget that beneath every shabby coat beats a human heart worthy of respect." The weight of James's words settled over the table like a heavy blanket. Chen thought about his own journey, how he'd started as a busboy 20 years ago, how someone had given him a chance despite his own humble beginnings. Somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten what it felt like to be on the other side of prejudice. As the evening crowd continued their meals around them, James began sharing his vision for the Silver Spoon's future, one where excellence in cuisine would be matched by excellence in humanity. He spoke of programs to help the homeless community, of partnerships with local shelters, and of a new company culture that would measure success not just in. He found James already there, now dressed in a simple but clean button-down shirt and khakis, sitting at the bar with a stack of papers and a cup of coffee. The transformation in his appearance was subtle. He hadn't gone for the expensive suit Chen might have expected from a CEO. Instead, he'd chosen clothing that bridged the gap between approachability and professionalism. "Good morning, Richard," James smiled, gesturing to the coffee pot. "I hope you don't mind that I made myself at home. We have a lot to discuss before the staff arrives." Chen poured himself a cup of coffee, noting how James had already learned to use their commercial machine. It was clear this wasn't just another corporate takeover where the new owner barely knew how the business operated. "I spent the night thinking about what you said," Chen admitted, settling onto a bar stool. "About dignity and hospitality. I keep wondering how many potential regular customers I might have turned away just because of how they looked." James nodded thoughtfully, pulling out a worn notebook filled with handwritten notes. "You know, during my month of observations, I visited this location 3 times before yesterday. The first time, one of your servers, I think her name was Betty, actually offered me a bowl of soup when she found me sitting outside during her break." Chen remembered Betty, a grandmother who'd been serving at the Silver Spoon for over a decade. She was always sneaking extra bread to families with children and keeping granola bars in her apron for anyone who looked hungry. "She did that without knowing who you were," Chen realized aloud, a mix of pride and shame washing over him. "Exactly," James replied, flipping through his notebook. "That's the kind of compassion you can't train into people. But you can create an environment where it's encouraged rather than discouraged." Over the next hour, James shared his vision for transforming the Silver Spoon. The restaurant would maintain its high standards of food and service, but it would also introduce new initiatives. Every Monday, when they were typically closed, they would host a community dinner for those in need. The kitchen would partner with local food banks to reduce waste and provide meals to shelters. "But won't this affect our image?" Chen couldn't help asking, though he immediately felt ashamed of the question. James leaned back, studying Chen with understanding eyes. "Let me tell you a story. 25 years ago, I was living on these very streets. I had lost everything, my job, my home, my dignity. One day, I was sitting outside a restaurant, much like this one, when the owner came out. Instead of shooing me away, he offered me a job washing dishes." Chen listened intently as James continued, "That man saw past my circumstances to my potential. He became my mentor, teaching me everything about the restaurant business. When he retired, he helped me secure a loan to buy my first restaurant. That's why I started Culinary Ventures International, not just to make money, but to create opportunities for others like someone once did for me." The story hung in the air between them as the first rays of sunlight began to paint the dining room in warm hues. Chen thought about his own journey, how different his life might have been if someone hadn't given him a chance. "We're not just in the food business, Richard," James said, closing his notebook. "We're in the business of changing lives. Sometimes that means serving a $200 bottle of wine, and sometimes it means offering a hot meal to someone who hasn't eaten in days. Both customers deserve the same level of dignity and respect." As they discussed the practical details of implementing these changes, the first staff members began arriving for their shifts. Chen watched as they did double takes at seeing James, now recognizing him as more than just the homeless man from yesterday. James greeted each one by name, having memorized them from his previous visits. Betty arrived for her morning shift, and James called her over. When he revealed who he was and commended her for her kindness during his undercover visits, she burst into tears. "I just did what my mama taught me," she said, wiping her eyes. "Everyone deserves a little kindness." James smiled warmly. That's exactly the philosophy we want to build on. In fact, I'd like to promote you to our new community outreach coordinator. You'll help us organize our community dinners and work with local shelters. The joy on Betty's face made Chen's heart swell. He realized that in all his years of managing by the books, he'd overlooked the most valuable asset any restaurant could have, the genuine compassion of its people. As the morning progressed and more staff arrived, James and Chen began sharing the new vision for the Silver Spoon. Instead of resistance or skepticism, they were met with enthusiasm and immediate offers to help. The prep cook knew of a shelter that could use their excess food. The bartender suggested creating a special cocktail where a portion of proceeds would go to homeless services. The hostess mentioned her church group might want to volunteer during the community dinners. What had started as a humbling lesson in judgment was transforming into something much bigger, a revolution in how a high-end restaurant could serve its entire community, not just its wealthy patrons. Chen looked around at his excited staff, at James's approving smile, and at the restaurant he thought he knew so well but was seeing in a completely new light. The Silver Spoon was about to become much more than just another fine dining establishment. It was about to become a beacon of hope and dignity in the community, proving that true class had nothing to do with the price of wine and everything to do with the size of one's heart. 2 weeks after James's revelation, the Silver Spoon was buzzing with a different kind of energy. The regular dinner service was winding down, and the staff was preparing for their first community dinner the following day. Chen stood in the middle of the dining room, watching as his team transformed the space. These tables should be pushed together, Betty suggested, now confidently wearing her new name tag that read, Community Outreach Coordinator. It'll encourage people to talk to each other, make it feel more like a family dinner than a charity event. The transformation wasn't just in the dining room layout. Over the past 2 weeks, Chen had noticed subtle but significant changes in how his staff carried themselves. The rigid formality that he'd once insisted upon had given way to something more genuine, a warmth that didn't compromise professionalism but enhanced it. The kitchen door swung open, and out came David, their head chef, carrying a sample of tomorrow's menu. Unlike their usual fancy presentations, these dishes were hearty, nutritious, and made with the same care they put into their most expensive meals. "Try this," David said, placing a bowl of aromatic stew on the bar. "It's my grandmother's recipe. She used to make it for the whole neighborhood during tough times. Simple ingredients, but it fills both the stomach and the soul." Chen tasted the stew, and memories of his own childhood flooded back, times when his family had struggled but always managed to share what little they had with neighbors. The flavors were complex yet comforting, proving that good food didn't need expensive ingredients to be exceptional. James walked in just then, carrying boxes of donated blankets and warm clothing that would be distributed the next day. Over the past 2 weeks, he'd been a constant presence, not just giving orders but working alongside everyone, showing by example how to bridge the gap between high-end dining and community service. The local news called again, James announced, setting down the boxes. "They want to cover tomorrow's dinner. I told them no cameras inside, we're not doing this for publicity. Our guests deserve to eat in dignity, not be part of a media circus." Chen nodded in agreement, remembering how his old self would have jumped at the chance for free publicity. Now he understood that true impact often happened quietly, without fanfare or recognition. The restaurant's regulars had noticed the changes too. When word spread about their new initiatives, instead of complaints about mixing social classes, they received an outpouring of support. One regular guest, a local business owner, offered to sponsor several community dinners. Another, a retired teacher, volunteered to provide basic computer training to anyone interested in finding work. "You know what surprised me most?" Betty said, adjusting a vase of fresh flowers on one of the tables. "How many of our regular customers have shared their own stories of struggling? That fancy lawyer who always sits at table 7? He told me he was homeless for a year during law school. Now he's offering free legal advice during our community dinners. As they continued preparing for the next day, Chen's phone buzzed with a text. It was from Tom, a man who'd been hired as their new dishwasher last week, someone who'd been living on the streets until James met him during his undercover visits. "Just finished my shift," the message read. "First week's pay going toward a room rental. Thank you for the chance." Chen showed the message to James, who smiled warmly. "That's what this is all about," James said. "Sometimes people just need someone to believe in them." Speaking of which, how are the cooking classes coming along? The cooking classes had been Chen's idea, a way to provide job skills to community members interested in restaurant work. They'd converted their private dining room into a teaching space during off hours, with the kitchen staff volunteering as instructors. "We've got 15 people signed up for the first session," Chen replied proudly. David's designed a curriculum that starts with kitchen basics and builds up to professional techniques. A few other restaurants have even agreed to consider our graduates for job openings. The front door chimed unexpectedly, and everyone looked up to see an elderly woman standing there, clutching a large Tupperware container. Chen recognized her as Mrs. Li from the neighborhood Chinese restaurant down the street. "I heard what you're doing," she said, placing the container on the nearest table. "These are dumplings for tomorrow. My mother made these for me when we first came to this country with nothing. Now I make them for others who need a taste of home." This had been happening more and more, local businesses and neighbors bringing contributions, wanting to be part of something bigger than themselves. What had started as one restaurant's initiative was sparking a community-wide movement. As the evening wore on, Chen found himself in his office, updating the restaurant's mission statement. The old version had been all about culinary excellence and exclusive dining experiences. The new one spoke of community, dignity, and using food as a bridge between people of all backgrounds. Looking through the office window into the dining room, he watched James teaching Tom how to properly set a table for fine dining service. There was such patience and respect in their interaction, no condescension, just one human being sharing knowledge with another. Chen thought about how much he'd changed in just 2 weeks. His old fears about maintaining the restaurant's image seemed trivial now. The silver spoon hadn't lost its elegance, it had gained something far more valuable, a soul. A knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. It was David, holding another bowl of stew. "Made some adjustments to the recipe," he said. "Would you mind tasting it again? I want everything to be perfect for tomorrow." Perfect. Chen used to think that meant spotless glasses and precise table settings. Now he understood that true perfection lay in the genuine smile of a server, in the dignity of a shared meal, in the hope that came with a second chance. As he tasted the stew, Chen realized that the Silver Spoon had become more than just a restaurant, it had become a testament to the fact that one person's compassion could spark a chain reaction of kindness that could transform an entire community. Monday morning arrived with a gentle rain washing the city streets. Chen stood at the Silver Spoon's entrance at 6 a.m., watching as his staff arrived early, each person carrying an extra spark of purpose in their step. Today wasn't just another day at work, it was the day they'd been preparing for, their first community dinner. The kitchen hummed with activity as David and his team prepared enormous batches of food. The aromas of fresh bread, simmering stews, and Mrs. Li's dumplings filled the air. In the dining room, Betty coordinated with volunteers who had shown up to help, many of them regular customers who wanted to be part of this new chapter. "The flowers are from my garden," said an elderly regular customer, arranging bright blooms in simple vases. "Everyone deserves to eat surrounded by beauty." She had been coming to the Silver Spoon every Thursday for the past decade, and now she was here in jeans and a comfortable sweater, ready to serve others. James arrived carrying boxes of new aprons for the volunteers. "Remember," he gathered everyone for a brief meeting, "tonight isn't about us helping them. It's about all of us coming together as one community. Every person who walks through that door is our guest, deserving the same respect we show during our regular service." Chen noticed how James had purposefully mixed the volunteers so that former homeless individuals who'd found jobs worked alongside business executives who usually sat at their best tables. Status and social barriers were dissolving before his eyes. As noon approached, Chen felt a knot in his stomach. Despite all their planning, they didn't know exactly how many people would come. They had spread the word through local shelters and community centers, but would people trust that this was genuine? Would they feel comfortable entering a high-end restaurant? His questions were answered at exactly 5 p.m. when they opened the doors. A line had already formed outside, people of all ages and backgrounds, some in worn clothes, others clearly coming straight from work at construction sites or office buildings. "Welcome to the Silver Spoon," Chen said to each person, the greeting he'd used thousands of times before now carrying new weight. Betty stood beside him, helping people find seats at the family-style tables. The dining room quickly filled with conversation and laughter, the awkwardness melting away as food and humanity brought people together. Among the guests was a young woman with 2 small children. Chen overheard her telling Betty that she worked 2 jobs but still struggled to make ends meet. Her children's eyes widened at the elegant surroundings, and the little boy whispered, "Mama, it's like a castle." David emerged from the kitchen, not just to supervise but to serve. He moved from table to table, explaining each dish with the same pride and attention he gave to their most expensive meals. The secret ingredient in the stew, he told a table of guests, is time. Good food can't be rushed, and neither can building a community. As the evening progressed, Chen witnessed countless moments that touched his heart. A businessman taught a teenager how to properly hold a soup spoon. A former guest who'd found housing through their program now volunteered, serving others with understanding in his eyes. Mrs. Li sat with a group of recent immigrants, sharing stories of her own journey in their native language. The atmosphere was far from the stuffiness Chen had once insisted upon. Instead, there was a warm buzz of genuine connection. People shared their stories, their struggles, and their dreams. A construction worker discussed job opportunities with an IT professional at his table. A retired nurse offered health advice to a young mother. The restaurant had become more than a place to eat, it was a space where hope and dignity were served alongside the food. Around 7 p.m., James gathered everyone's attention by gently tapping a glass. "Before we serve dessert," he said, "I want to share something with you all. 25 years ago, I sat on these very streets, feeling invisible. Today, I own this restaurant and many others. But that's not what makes me rich. What makes me rich is seeing all of you here, sharing this space, proving that when we strip away our labels and pretenses, we're all just people who deserve respect and opportunity." His words resonated through the room, and Chen noticed tears in many eyes, including his own. He thought about how close he had come to calling the police on James that first night, how his prejudices had nearly cost him the chance to be part of this transformation. The dessert was simple, warm apple crisp with vanilla ice cream, but Chen had never seen food bring such joy. Children's faces lit up, elderly guests closed their eyes in pleasure, and conversations continued to flow freely around the tables. As the evening wound down, Chen watched as guests helped stack chairs and clear tables, insisting on contributing despite the staff's protests. A young man approached him, clutching a piece of paper with information about their cooking classes. "I used to work in restaurants before everything fell apart," he said quietly. "Do you really think I could get back into it?" "We start classes next week," Chen replied, thinking of Tom's success. "And we'll be here every Monday for dinner until then. This isn't just a one-time event, this is our new normal." Later that night, after the last guest had left and the final dish had been washed, the staff gathered for their usual end-of-shift meeting. But instead of discussing sales figures or service issues, they shared stories from the evening. Every person had been touched by an interaction, changed by a conversation, moved by the simple power of treating everyone with dignity. James sat quietly, listening to everyone's stories with a proud smile. When the sharing finished, he stood up. "This," he said, gesturing to the room around them, "is the true measure of a restaurant's success. Not in dollars or reviews, but in the lives we touch and the community we build." Chen looked around at his team, no, his family, and saw in their tired but happy faces the same realization he'd come to: they had all been part of something extraordinary. The Silver Spoon hadn't just opened its doors to the community, it had opened its heart. 3 months after their first community dinner, the Silver Spoon had become a symbol of hope in the city. What started as one evening of service had blossomed into a movement that transformed not just the restaurant, but the entire neighborhood. Chen sat in his office early one morning, reviewing the changes that had taken place since that fateful night when James first walked through their door. The wall of his office, once decorated with framed restaurant reviews and awards, now displayed something far more meaningful: photographs of their cooking program graduates in their chef whites, letters from community members whose lives had been touched, and news clippings about the ripple effect their initiative had created. A knock on his door interrupted his reflection. It was Tom, their former dishwasher, who had now worked his way up to line cook. "Chef David asked me to bring you the new training manual," he said, placing a thick binder on Chen's desk. "We added a section about cooking on a budget and modified some recipes to be more cost-effective for students to practice at home." The cooking program had exceeded all expectations. Out of their first class of 15 students, 12 had already found jobs in local restaurants. The success had caught the attention of other establishments, and now 3 more restaurants in the city had started similar programs. "How's the apartment working out?" Chen asked, remembering how Tom had started in their program just a few months ago. "Just signed the lease for another 6 months, Tom beamed. "And I'm helping 2 guys from the shelter get into the next cooking class. They remind me of myself before all this." The morning light streamed through the window as Betty bustled in, carrying her ever-present clipboard. The community dinner program had grown so much that it required significant coordination. "We need to talk about expanding the Monday dinners," she said, settling into a chair. "We're having to turn people away, and that breaks my heart." It was true. What started as serving 50 to 60 people had grown to over 200 each Monday. The success had inspired other restaurants in the area to open their doors on different nights of the week, creating a network of community meals that ensured nobody in the neighborhood had to go hungry. James walked in, having overheard the conversation. He'd been splitting his time between the Silver Spoon and implementing similar programs at his other restaurants across the country. "I think it's time we took the next step," he said, pulling up a chair. "I've been in talks with the owner of the vacant building next door." Chen's eyes widened as James spread out architectural plans on his desk. The drawings showed the Silver Spoon expanded into the neighboring building, with a dedicated community dining space, classroom kitchen, and career resource center. "We're not just feeding people anymore," James explained, his eyes bright with purpose. "We're creating a model that other restaurants can follow. The Silver Spoon can be the blueprint for how the restaurant industry can be a force for positive change in communities everywhere." The morning staff began arriving, and Chen watched through his office window as they prepared for another day. The changes were visible in every aspect of the restaurant. The host stand now displayed both the evening's tasting menu and information about community resources. The wine cellar had been partially converted to store donations of non-perishable foods. Even the elegant private dining room doubled as a classroom 4 days a week. David appeared in the doorway, excitement evident on his face. "You need to see this," he said, gesturing for them to follow him to the kitchen. There, displayed on the wall, was a collection of photographs, their original cooking class students now teaching new participants, sharing not just culinary skills but hope. "Remember when we worried this would hurt our regular business?" Chen asked, shaking his head at his former concerns. In reality, the Silver Spoon had never been more successful. Their regular customers had embraced the mission, often volunteering and donating. Some even requested to book their special occasions on community dinner nights, wanting to be part of the inclusive atmosphere. The prep kitchen was already bustling with activity. Students from the current cooking class worked alongside experienced chefs, learning both culinary skills and life lessons. Chen overheard a veteran chef teaching a young student about more than just knife skills. He was sharing wisdom about perseverance, dignity, and the importance of lifting others up as you climb. "We got another call from that restaurant group in Chicago," Betty mentioned, checking her notes. "They want to know if we can consult on setting up a similar program. That makes 5 cities now that want to replicate what we're doing here." James nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly what we hoped for. Change doesn't happen in isolation. It spreads person by person, restaurant by restaurant, community by community." As they discussed expansion plans, a delivery arrived, fresh produce from a local farm. The farmer, a regular dinner guest, had started donating excess crops to their program. In return, several community dinner participants had begun helping at his farm, learning sustainable agriculture alongside culinary skills. "You know what amazes me most?" Chen said, watching the bustling activity around him. "How natural it all feels now. The walls we thought existed between fine dining and community service, between different social classes, they were all in our minds." James placed a hand on Chen's shoulder. "That's because we stopped seeing it as us helping them and started seeing it as all of us growing together. Every person who walks through those doors, whether they're here for a luxury dinner or a community meal, is part of the Silver Spoon family." The morning sun fully illuminated the kitchen now, glinting off stainless steel surfaces and creating halos around busy figures. In just 3 months, they had proven that a restaurant could maintain its highest standards while opening its heart to the community. The Silver Spoon had become more than a place to eat, it was a place where lives were transformed, where dignity was served daily, and where the true meaning of hospitality was demonstrated through actions rather than words. As Chen watched a new student master their first perfect knife cut, celebration erupting from those around them, he realized that the true transformation hadn't been in the restaurant's operations or even its mission. The real change had been in the hearts and minds of everyone involved, himself included. They had all learned that true excellence wasn't measured in stars or reviews, but in the lives touched and the hope restored. 1 year had passed since the night James Richardson walked into the Silver Spoon dressed as a homeless man. The restaurant was hosting a special anniversary celebration, but it wasn't the typical upscale gathering one might expect. Instead, the dining room was filled with a beautiful tapestry of humanity, regular customers, community dinner participants, cooking program graduates, local business owners, and volunteers all sharing the same space. Chen stood near the entrance, overwhelmed by the sight before him. The expansion into the neighboring building was complete, doubling their capacity and creating a space that seamlessly blended fine dining with community service. The new wing, named the Community Kitchen, operated 7 days a week, offering classes, meals, and hope to anyone who walked through its doors. "Quite a change from a year ago, isn't it?" James appeared beside him, dressed in the same weathered jacket he'd worn that first night. It was now framed in a simple display case near the entrance, along with the story of how the Silver Spoon's transformation began. "I almost called the police on you that night," Chen chuckled, still amazed at how far they'd come. "Now we have police officers volunteering at our community dinners and referring people to our programs." The evening celebration was in full swing. David and his kitchen team, including graduates from their cooking program, had prepared a menu that combined dishes from their regular fine dining service with recipes contributed by community members. Mrs. Lee's dumplings, now a staple at their events, sat alongside perfectly seared foie gras. Betty wove through the crowd, no longer needing her clipboard to coordinate everything. The community program had become so integrated into the Silver Spoon's operations that it ran as smoothly as their regular service. She stopped to hug a young woman who had recently moved from their shelter program into her own apartment and started working as a prep cook at a nearby restaurant. Remember when we thought this would ruin the restaurant? Chen asked as he and James found a quiet moment at the bar. Now we have a 3-month waiting list for regular reservations, and every major food critic has written about how we've redefined what a fine dining establishment can be. James nodded, sipping his water. But that's not what matters most. Look around, really look at what's happening here. Chen surveyed the room, taking in the scene. A prominent business executive was deep in conversation with a former homeless man about starting a job training program at his company. A retired teacher who'd been living in her car before finding help through their program was now tutoring children from the shelter. Tom, their success story from the early days, was training new cooking students with the confidence of a seasoned professional. The walls that had once seemed so essential to maintaining the Silver Spoon's exclusive image had completely dissolved. In their place was something far more valuable, a genuine community where everyone's dignity was honored and everyone's potential was recognized. We've had inquiries from restaurants in 23 cities now, James shared, pulling out his worn notebook. They all want to know how to implement similar programs. But you know what I tell them first? He paused, looking Chen in the eyes. I tell them it starts with changing how they see people. Everything else follows from that. As if to prove his point, the front door opened, and a disheveled man hesitantly peered in. Without missing a beat, Betty walked over to welcome him, just as she would any other guest. You're just in time for our celebration, she said warmly, leading him to a table. Everyone's welcome here. The evening continued with speeches and sharing of stories. People stood up one by one to talk about how the Silver Spoon had impacted their lives. A young mother spoke about how the cooking program had led to a career that allowed her to support her children. A wealthy businessman admitted that volunteering at community dinners had changed his perspective on homelessness and inspired him to start a housing initiative. David took the microphone to make an announcement. Starting next month, we're launching a food truck program, he said proudly. Our cooking program graduates will operate trucks throughout the city, providing good food at affordable prices in neighborhoods that need it most. And yes, each truck will accept both credit cards and dignity vouchers. The dignity vouchers had been another innovation, a way for people to access meals without the stigma of traditional food assistance programs. Local businesses and individuals could purchase these vouchers and distribute them or leave them at the restaurant for anyone who needed them. As the celebration continued, Chen found himself drawn to the wall of photographs in the new wing. It had grown exponentially over the year, each picture telling a story of transformation. There were before and after shots of program participants, images of community dinners, and photos of their expanding network of partner restaurants implementing similar programs. James joined him at the wall. You know what's remarkable, he mused. We didn't just change the Silver Spoon, we changed the conversation about what restaurants can be. We showed that luxury and compassion aren't mutually exclusive, that dignity and fine dining can go hand in hand. The sound of laughter drew their attention back to the main dining room. Someone had started playing piano, a community dinner regular who turned out to be a former concert pianist. The music filled the space as people from all walks of life continued to share meals and stories. I have a confession to make, James said quietly. That first night, when you almost called the police? I was testing more than just how you treated homeless people. I was testing whether the Silver Spoon could be what I envisioned, a place where transformation was possible, where dignity wasn't determined by what was in someone's wallet. Chen understood now. The Silver Spoon had become exactly that, a place where lives were transformed, not just through food and job training, but through the recognition of each person's inherent worth. As the evening drew to a close, Chen found himself back at the entrance, saying goodbye to guests. Each person who left carried not just memories of a celebration, but a piece of the dream that had become reality within these walls. The last to leave was the hesitant man who had arrived late. He stopped at the door, turned back to Chen, and said softly, I didn't believe places like this existed. Thank you for showing me they do. After the final guest departed, Chen and James stood in the empty restaurant. The space still hummed with the energy of the evening, with the power of hundreds of lives intersecting and changing each other. So, James smiled, ready for another year? Chen looked around at the restaurant that had become so much more than he ever imagined possible. More than ready, he replied. We're just getting started. And he knew it was true. The silver spoon had become a beacon of hope, proving that when people dare to see past appearances and prejudices, when they choose to believe in the dignity of every human being, transformation isn't just possible, it's inevitable.